A single photograph. For more than a century, it remained in the archives, admired for its dignity and grace. But when modern technology finally revealed what had been hidden in plain sight all along, scientists could hardly believe what they saw. What was it? What impossible detail had everyone missed? If you want to discover stories that history has forgotten, click the subscribe button and like this video. You won't believe where this journey will take us. Charleston, South Carolina, October 1899. Inside the studio of Mr. William Harrison, one of the few photographers in the city who welcomed black clientele, a family prepared for a portrait that would become one of the most extraordinary photographs in American history. The studio smelled of developing chemicals and furniture polish. Heavy velvet curtains blocked the afternoon sun, while gas lamps illuminated a painted backdrop, depicting a library with leather-bound books. This was the fantasy Harrison sold, a vision of prosperity and refinement. Thomas, the patriarch, wore a three-piece suit of dark wool, perfectly tailored despite his profession as a master carpenter. His watch chain gleamed across his vest. Elizabeth, his wife, stood beside him in an elegant burgundy silk dress with black lace at the collar, her hair styled in the fashionable Gibson girl manner. Their 5 children ranged from 23 down to 6 years old. The eldest son wore a suit nearly as fine as his father's. The daughters wore white blouses with high collars and long dark skirts. The middle son looked uncomfortable in his stiff collar but stood straight. And then there was Samuel, the youngest. Just 6 years old, wearing a small suit with short pants, white stockings, and polished shoes. His face held that mixture of solemnity and barely contained fidgeting that all children displayed before cameras when exposures required absolute stillness. Harrison positioned them carefully. Thomas and Elizabeth in the center, children arranged by height, with young Samuel in the front right. He placed a small table beside them, draping it with embroidered cloth, and setting an open book upon it. "Now, everyone hold very still," Harrison instructed. "Look at the lens. Think of something that makes you proud." The family froze. Samuel placed his hands at his sides, one resting lightly against his father's leg. The shutter opened. Light poured through the lens. Time stopped. The photograph was taken. Thomas paid $3 and returned 2 weeks later for the prints. That photograph hung in their parlor for years, then traveled through relocations and hardships until it was donated to the National Museum of African American History and Culture. It was cataloged, admired, studied, but no one noticed. The secret was there, captured in silver halide crystals, but invisible for the next 124 years. Dr. Rachel Foster had been working at the National Museum of African American History and Culture for 3 years. Her job was methodical, often repetitive, but deeply meaningful, scanning the museum's vast photograph collection using technology that could capture details invisible to the naked eye. The new scanner was a marvel, capable of 4,800 dots per inch resolution, revealing fabric texture, paper grain, even individual crystals of the original silver emulsion. It was designed to preserve fragile images digitally while extracting every possible detail. On a frigid January morning in 2023, Rachel pulled a photograph from climate-controlled storage. The label read, "Thomas Family, Charleston, SC, 1899. Studio portrait. Donated 1987. She had seen it before. Beautiful, striking in its dignity. The family's clothing, their posture, their direct gaze spoke of pride and achievement. Exactly the kind of image the museum treasured. Evidence of black prosperity in an era when such narratives were systematically erased. Rachel placed the photograph on the scanner bed and initiated the scan. The image materialized line by line in stunning clarity. Faces appeared first, then clothing, the painted backdrop, the decorative table. Then the scan reached the bottom, where young Samuel stood. Rachel's hand froze. She leaned closer, her breath catching. Something about the child's right hand looked unexpected. She zoomed in once, then again, and again, until the pixels resolved into perfect clarity. "Oh my God," she whispered. Samuel's right hand, resting against his father's leg, had 6 fingers. Not a blurred artifact, not a trick of light. 6 distinct, fully formed fingers, clearly visible in the high-resolution scan. Rachel sat back, her mind racing. She zoomed to the left hand. Normal. 5 fingers. She returned to the right hand. 6 fingers, unmistakable. The extra digit appeared on the pinky side. Post-axial, polydactyly. It wasn't some vestigial nub. It looked proportional, functional, just another finger. Rachel's heart pounded as she searched the museum's database. Who was this family? Were there other photographs? Medical records? Within an hour, she had a name. Thomas, master carpenter of Charleston. Within 2 hours, she made a phone call that would change everything. "Dr. Webb, this is Dr. Rachel Foster from the National Museum of African American History. I need you to come to Washington immediately. I think I found something extraordinary." Dr. Marcus Webb arrived at the museum 48 hours later. A geneticist at Johns Hopkins University specializing in hereditary conditions in African American populations, Marcus approached his work with deep respect for the painful history of how black bodies had been exploited in medical research. Rachel met him in the examination room, the 1899 photograph resting in an archival sleeve on a light table. Beside it, her laptop displayed the high-resolution scan. "Thank you for coming," Rachel said. "I need you to tell me I'm not imagining this." "Oh," Marcus pulled on white cotton gloves and lifted the photograph, studying it with his naked eye. At normal viewing distance, the family looked exactly as expected, dignified, well-dressed, proud. He could barely make out individual fingers at this resolution. Then he looked at the digital scan. Rachel had zoomed in on Samuel's right hand. Marcus's eyes widened. "Bilateral or unilateral?" "Unilateral. Only the right hand." Marcus studied the image intently. Post-axial polydactyly. The extra digit is beside the pinky finger. And look, it's not deformed. It appears fully formed with complete articulation. He sat back, removing his glasses. "This is remarkable. Polydactyly occurs in about 1 in every 1,000 births. But to capture it so clearly in an 1899 photograph, and for it to go unnoticed for over a century..." "There's more," Rachel said, pulling out a thin folder. "The donor said this family were master carpenters in Charleston, multiple generations of craftsmen, highly respected." Marcus's interest sharpened. "Multiple generations? Do we know if the trait appeared in other family members?" "That's what I need your help to find out." They began painstaking historical research. The 1900 census gave them basic information. Thomas, born approximately 1849, occupation carpenter. Elizabeth, his wife, 5 children, including Samuel, age 7. A property deed from 1897 showed Thomas had purchased a building on King Street, significant for a black man in that era. A clerk's notation read, "Thomas, master carpenter of considerable reputation." "They weren't struggling," Rachel observed. "This was a successful family." Marcus nodded. "Which makes me wonder, if this child had a 6th finger and the family was prosperous, they clearly didn't hide it. They posed him front and center in a professional portrait." "What does that tell us?" "Perhaps they didn't see it as shameful," Marcus replied. "Or they knew about it and considered it normal because it ran in the family." Rachel leaned forward. "Then we need to trace this lineage. If it's hereditary, there could be descendants alive today." The work was slow and frustrating. Many post-Reconstruction records were incomplete, lost, or deliberately destroyed. Black families' births often went unregistered. The Great Migration scattered families nationwide, breaking documentation chains. But Rachel was persistent and Marcus patient. They worked together across months, slowly piecing together the Thomas family's story. Church records from Moore Street Baptist Church in Charleston provided the first breakthrough. Thomas and Elizabeth had been active members, and meticulous record-keeping revealed their children's births and baptisms. Samuel, born March 1893. His older siblings, James, Clara, Margaret, and William. But there was something else, a note in Samuel's baptismal record written in careful hand. "Received into God's grace, marked with his distinction, blessed be his Maker's hands." "Maker's hands," Marcus repeated. "That's specific language." Rachel searched digitized church records. "Look at this. A church newsletter from 1905 mentions Thomas's carpentry business taking on apprentices. It says, 'Continuing the tradition of the maker's hands passed from father to son.'" Marcus felt discovery's thrill. It's a family phrase, something inherited, something special about their hands. The genealogical trail led forward. James, the eldest, stayed in Charleston, continuing the carpentry business. His children appeared in the 1920 census. One son, Robert, appeared in city directories through the 1940s as a woodworker. Then the trail went cold. Robert disappeared from Charleston records after 1947. Marcus checked Great Migration records, databases of black Americans who moved north during the World Wars. There, in a 1948 Philadelphia directory, Robert Thomas, carpenter South Street. From Philadelphia, the trail continued. Robert's children, then grandchildren. Some stayed in Pennsylvania, others scattered to Maryland, New Jersey, New York. Each generation represented hours of searching. 3 months into their research, Rachel found a genealogy forum post that made her hands shake. "Marcus," she called. "I think I found him. A living descendant." The post was from David Clark, researching his Charleston ancestors named Thomas, mentioning carpentry, mentioning a family story about special hands. Rachel sent a message immediately. The response came within an hour. "Yes. When can we meet? I've been waiting my whole life to understand my family's story." Dr. David Clark drove to the museum on a Saturday morning in early April. He was 47, an orthopedic surgeon at a Baltimore hospital, and had been researching his Charleston roots for nearly 6 years. "My grandfather died when I was 15, David explained in the conference room. But he used to tell stories about our ancestors, about Thomas the carpenter who built Charleston's finest furniture, about hands that could do things other hands couldn't, about a gift that passed through blood. He paused, emotion crossing his face. I thought they were exaggerated stories, but then my daughter was born. Rachel leaned forward. David, may I ask something personal? Do you have any unusual genetic characteristics? David held out his right hand, palm up. There, beside his pinky finger, was a sixth finger, fully formed, naturally positioned, clearly functional. Only my right hand, he said quietly. I was born with it. Doctors told my parents to have it surgically removed. They said it would make life easier, but my grandfather refused. He said, that hand is who we are. Don't you dare cut away what God and blood gave him. Marcus stared, his mind racing. Do you know if other family members have this trait? My grandfather had it. Same hand, same finger. He was a carpenter like his father and grandfather. He joked that the extra finger made him better at his craft. David's voice thickened. My daughter has it too. She's 7. When she was born and I saw that little sixth finger, I understood. It's not a defect. It's who we are. Rachel slid the 1899 photograph toward David. We believe this is your great-great-grandfather, Thomas. And this, she pointed to Samuel, we believe this is your great-grandfather. David took the photograph with trembling hands. He stared, taking in the formal poses, the fine clothing, the dignity. Then he looked at Samuel. Even in the original photograph, knowing what to look for, he could barely make out the subtle difference in the child's right hand. I've never seen his face, David whispered. My grandfather described him, but no photographs survived. He looked up, tears shining. How did you find this? Rachel explained the scanning technology. Marcus explained the genetic implications. We'd like to conduct genetic testing, Marcus said carefully. With your permission. If we can map the mutation and trace it through your family, we might be documenting one of the longest hereditary genetic traits in American history. David nodded. What would you need? Blood samples. From you, willing family members, and ideally your daughter, if you consent. I'll do it, David said immediately. My daughter's proud of her hand. She calls it her special finger. She'll want to be part of this. The genetic testing took 6 weeks. Marcus collected blood samples from David, 3 cousins who agreed to participate, and with careful consent, from David's daughter Emma. The samples went to Johns Hopkins Genetics Lab for sequencing and analysis. While waiting for results, Marcus dove into medical literature. Polydactyly was well documented, occurring in approximately 1 in 1,000 births. It could be isolated or part of genetic syndromes. Post-axial polydactyly, extra digits on the pinky side, was more common in African and African American populations, suggesting ancient genetic origins. But what made a trait persist across generations? Most polydactyly cases were sporadic, occurring randomly. Hereditary cases existed, but rarely extended beyond 3 or 4 generations in documented medical literature. If David's family truly traced this trait back to Samuel in 1899, and if Samuel had inherited it from his father Thomas, and if family stories about earlier generations were accurate, they might be looking at one of the longest documented hereditary polydactyly lineages in medical history. The results arrived on a Tuesday morning. Marcus called Rachel and David immediately, asking them to meet at his Johns Hopkins office. When they gathered around his desk, Marcus pulled up genetic sequencing data on his monitor. I've confirmed it, he began, his voice tight with excitement. The polydactyly in your family is caused by a specific mutation in the GLI3 gene, which regulates limb development during fetal formation. He pulled up a molecular diagram. This particular variant is exceptionally rare. I've searched global genetic databases. There are fewer than 20 documented cases worldwide with this exact mutation. David leaned forward. What does that mean? It means your family's genetic line is extraordinarily unique, Marcus continued. Based on the genealogical records Rachel compiled and the genetic testing we've conducted, we can now trace this trait back at least 6 confirmed generations. From your daughter Emma, born 2016, back to Samuel in the 1890s. He pulled up a family tree showing the documented generations with red markers indicating confirmed polydactyly. And based on family oral history and the church records that reference maker's hands being passed from father to son, the trait likely extends back even further, possibly to Thomas's father or grandfather, which would mean 8 to 10 generations total. Rachel spoke quietly. That would place the origin sometime in the early to mid-1800s, possibly in the enslaved population. Marcus nodded. The GLI3 mutation likely originated in West Africa. When your ancestor was enslaved and brought to America, he carried that gene. Because polydactyly is a dominant trait, it had a high probability of being passed to each generation. David sat back, absorbing the information. My grandfather said the gift came from Africa, from ancestors who were makers and builders. He was right, Marcus said, and there's something else. He pulled up comparative data. I've been analyzing hand function and dexterity. David, your 12-fingered hands don't just give you more digits. They give you measurably superior fine motor control in specific tasks. Your ancestors weren't just proud because their hands were unique. They were proud because those hands made them genuinely exceptional craftsmen. With genetic confirmation, Marcus and Rachel intensified their historical research, determined to trace the trait as far back as possible. They returned to Charleston, visiting historical societies, church archives, and even elderly community members whose families had lived in the city for generations. Mr. James Washington, a 91-year-old archivist at a small low-country museum, provided unexpected insight. "Six-Finger Thomas?" he said, when Marcus mentioned the name. "My grandfather used to tell stories. Said Thomas was the finest craftsman he'd ever seen. Could shape wood like it was clay." He pulled out a worn leather journal, his grandfather's notes from the 1920s. "My grandfather was a wheelwright. He worked sometimes with the Charleston carpenters. He wrote this after Thomas passed away in 1923. Marcus read aloud. "Thomas died yesterday, age 75. The finest carpenter Charleston ever knew. His son James carries on the work, and James's boy too, both with their grandfather's blessed hands. They say the gift goes back to Thomas's father, and his father before him, back to the old country before the chains." Rachel's eyes widened. "Back to Africa. The trait predated enslavement." Mr. Washington nodded. "That's what people believed. Something Thomas's ancestors brought with them across the water, something the slavers couldn't take away." Armed with this lead, Marcus contacted researchers specializing in African genetic populations. Through comparative databases and historical migration patterns, they identified a possible origin, a region in West Africa, specifically parts of modern-day Nigeria and Cameroon, where certain woodworking and metalworking guilds had been documented by colonial ethnographers in the late 1800s. One obscure anthropological text from 1887, written by a British colonial officer, described visiting a master carver's workshop. The craftsman possessed an unusual anatomical feature, 6 digits on each hand, which he claimed ran in his family line for generations, passed from master to apprentice within bloodlines. He attributed his extraordinary skill to this inherited distinction. Marcus showed the text to Rachel and David during their next meeting. "I can't prove definitively that this craftsman was your ancestor," he told David. "The historical record doesn't allow that level of specificity. But the geographic region, the time period, the craft tradition, and the hereditary nature of the trait all align." David traced the words on the page with his finger. "My grandfather said we were makers, that it was in our blood, passed down through generations, who refused to forget who they were, even in chains." But Rachel added, "What makes your family's story so powerful is that they didn't just survive the horror of enslavement, they preserved their identity through their craft. The polydactyly became a marker of that identity, a physical manifestation of unbroken lineage." Marcus pulled up the 1899 photograph on his laptop, zooming in on young Samuel's 6-fingered hand. This photograph captured more than a family portrait. It captured a genetic and cultural legacy that stretched back to Africa and forward to your daughter Emma. 10, possibly 12 generations of continuous transmission. Marcus, Rachel, and David decided to publish their findings. The paper, co-authored by all three, was titled "Hereditary Polydactyly as Cultural and Genetic Legacy, a Multi-Generational African-American Lineage." It was submitted to the Journal of Medical Genetics and Human Evolution. The response was immediate. The journal fast-tracked peer review, and within 2 months, the paper was accepted. But before publication, word spread through academic circles. Geneticists, historians, and anthropologists reached out, fascinated by the intersection of genetics, history, and cultural identity. The museum decided to mount a special exhibition, Hands of Legacy, the Thomas family story. Rachel curated it, featuring the 1899 photograph as the centerpiece, displayed alongside high-resolution details showing Samuel's 6-fingered hand. The exhibition included Harrison's medical sketches from 1904, genealogical charts tracing 10 generations, genetic diagrams explaining the GLI3 mutation, and contemporary photographs of David and Emma. David contributed his surgical instruments, displayed beside replicas of Thomas's carpentry tools. The visual parallel was striking, the same hands, separated by more than a century, both using their 12 fingers to create and heal. The exhibition opened in September 2023. Thousands visited in the first month. Major news outlets picked up the story. The Washington Post, NPR, the New York Times, international media. The photograph that had sat forgotten for 124 years now circulated globally. But something unexpected happened. David began receiving messages, dozens, then hundreds, from other people with polydactyly. Parents of children born with extra digits wrote that they had decided against surgical removal after reading about David's family. Adults who had hidden their hands their whole lives sent photos, many showing their faces alongside their unique anatomy for the first time. One message particularly moved David from a woman in Nigeria. "My son has hands like yours." In our village, we have stories of ancestors with these hands, craftsmen and healers. Reading your family's story helped me understand. This is not a curse. It is a gift that travels through blood. David read the message to Marcus and Rachel during the exhibition's opening night, his voice thick with emotion. For so long, I thought our story was just about my family, but it's bigger. It's about how difference can be strength. How something the medical world sees as an abnormality can be a source of identity, skill, and pride. Marcus nodded. Your family's story challenges how we think about genetic variation, not as defects to be corrected, but as diversity to be understood and sometimes celebrated. The exhibition's impact rippled outward. Medical schools began using David's family story in genetics curricula, teaching students about hereditary traits through the lens of cultural competence and respect. Support groups for families affected by polydactyly cited the exhibition as transformative, helping them reframe difference as distinction. 6 months after the exhibition opened, David sat with his daughter Emma at the museum, standing before the 1899 photograph. Emma was 7 now, old enough to understand what the image meant, what it said about who she was. That's Samuel, David said, pointing to the small figure in the front. He's your great-great-great-grandfather. He had hands like yours. Emma studied the photograph intently, then looked at her own right hand, flexing her 6 fingers. Did people make fun of him? David knelt beside her. We don't know for sure, but we know his family was proud of him. They dressed him in their best clothes and took him to a photographer's studio. That was expensive back then. They put him right in the front where everyone could see him. They didn't hide him. Like you and Mom didn't hide me, Emma said. Exactly like that. Emma returned her gaze to the photograph. Tell me again about the maker's hands. David smiled. Your great-great-great-great-grandfather Thomas was a carpenter. He built things from wood. His father was also a carpenter, and his father before him. They had hands like ours with the extra finger, and people said it made them the best craftsmen in Charleston. They called it maker's hands, because they could make things other people couldn't. And you're a doctor, Emma said. You fix people's hands. I do, and my extra finger helps me do surgery that other doctors find difficult. It gives me better control, better precision. Emma flexed her fingers again, watching them move. When I grow up, what will I make with my maker's hands? The question hung in the air, beautiful in its openness. David felt his throat tighten with emotion. Whatever you want, sweetheart. Whatever you dream. They stood together in silence, 3 centuries of genetic inheritance connecting them to the small boy in the photograph. Samuel, frozen at age 6, dressed in his finest clothes, his right hand resting against his father's leg, his 6 fingers captured in silver halide crystals, waiting 124 years to be seen. Later that evening, Emma asked if she could write a letter to Samuel. David helped her compose it. Dear great-great-great-grandfather Samuel, my name is Emma. I'm 7 years old. I have hands like yours, 6 fingers on my right hand. My daddy says you were proud of your hands, and your family was proud of you. I'm proud too. I'm proud of my hand, and I'm proud that we're family. Thank you for not hiding. Thank you for being in the picture so we could find you. Love, Emma. David placed the letter in a frame next to Emma's photo on his desk. 2 children, separated by 124 years, connected by 6 fingers and unbroken bloodline. Both photographed, both visible, both proud. 1 year after the exhibition opened, David returned to Charleston for the first time since childhood. He brought Emma, wanting her to see where her ancestors had lived and worked, to walk streets they had walked, to touch wood they might have shaped. They found the building where Thomas's carpentry shop had stood on King Street. It was a restaurant now, completely renovated, but the bones of the structure remained, the high ceilings, the wide door frames, the thick support beams that spoke of 19th century craftsmanship. The restaurant owner, learning why David and Emma had come, allowed them to explore. In the basement, beneath layers of modern renovation, original wood beams were still visible. David ran his hand, his 12-fingered hand, across the wood, feeling the marks of hand tools, the precision of joints fitted without nails or screws. Your great-great-great-great-grandfather made this, he told Emma, with hands like ours. They visited Morris Street Baptist Church where Samuel had been baptized. The current pastor welcomed them warmly, pulling out the original baptismal records to show Emma her ancestor's name written in careful script, along with a note about maker's hands. At the museum's Charleston satellite location, they saw a traveling version of the exhibition. Local families came, many descendants of the black craftsmen and tradespeople who had built Charleston's prosperity despite being denied its full benefits. They shared stories of their own ancestors, their own family traits, their own survival of history's cruelties. An elderly woman approached David and Emma. My great-grandfather knew Thomas, she said, used to tell stories about him. Said he was a quiet man, but his work spoke loud. Said you could always tell furniture Thomas made because it was perfect. Joints so tight, finish so smooth. Said Thomas had special hands. Emma held up her right hand. I have them too. The woman's eyes widened, then filled with tears. She took Emma's hand gently in both of hers. "Blessed child, you carry him with you." That evening, sitting on the hotel balcony overlooking Charleston Harbor, David told Emma about the Middle Passage, about the enslaved Africans who had been brought across that water in chains, about how her ancestor, perhaps Samuel's great-great-grandfather, had survived that journey with nothing but his body, his memory, and the genes that would be passed forward through generations. "They took everything from him," David said quietly. "His freedom, his home, his name, his language. But they couldn't take what was in his blood. And that traveled forward, through your great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, through Thomas, through Samuel, through my grandfather, through me, to you." Emma looked at her hand in the dimming light. "The gift that travels through blood. Yes. And I'll pass it to my children? Maybe. If you have children, and if they inherit the gene. The genetic trait is dominant, so there's a good chance." Emma smiled. "I hope they do. I hope they have makers' hands too." 6 months later, the academic paper won the Journal of Medical Genetics Award for Excellence in Historical Genetics Research. David, Rachel, and Marcus accepted it together at a ceremony in Baltimore. Now, in his acceptance speech, David spoke not about science or genetics, but about identity and survival. For 124 years, my great-great-grandfather Samuel stood in that photograph, his six-fingered hand visible but unseen. The technology to see him didn't exist yet. The framework to understand him didn't exist yet. But he was always there, waiting. And because his family was proud enough to photograph him, because archivists were careful enough to preserve that photograph, because researchers were curious enough to look closely, we finally saw him. We finally understood. And in seeing him, we saw ourselves. That's the power of not hiding. That's the legacy my family gave me, and the legacy I give my daughter. Be visible. Be proud. Be exactly who you are, because someone in the future might need to see you to understand themselves. The photograph of Samuel and his family now resides permanently in the National Museum of African American History and Culture's main hall, displayed prominently with interactive screens allowing visitors to zoom in on Samuel's hand and learn the full story. It has become one of the museum's most viewed exhibits. And sometimes, late at night, David pulls up the high-resolution scan on his computer, zooms in on Samuel's six-fingered hand, and feels the weight of connection across time. The same mutation, the same chromosomes, the same 12 fingers, linking him to a child who stood solemn and proud in a Charleston photography studio in 1899, not knowing his hand would speak across more than a century. Samuel couldn't have known his photograph would be magnified and studied, that his hand would become famous, that his genetic legacy would be documented and celebrated. He simply stood that day, dressed in his finest clothes, being exactly who he was. But his hand spoke across the years, and finally, someone had listened.